Hey, it's Soul with another video. Today I want to talk about a hot topic that a lot of fans and critics have been buzzing about, and unfortunately it's not about who Erator's real father is, or if Elune is really Sargeras from the distant future who came back through time to watch over Azeroth. It's just the Netherlight Crucible. Yeah, I know, damn. I'll start off with this opinion. I think Blizzard set themselves up for failure in a number of ways, and the Crucible is an example of how best intentions can lead to a team like Blizzard to develop themselves into a corner. Let's get another thing out front and center too. I am fine with the Crucible, or that I don't care as much as others might. Maybe it's because I understand the point of the system, or that I'm just another one of those casual players who doesn't understand what the real issue is. So Soul, if you don't care about it, why talk about it? Well, it's what I do, obviously. I'd like to share my perspective as to why I can understand it, think it's a bad idea, and still not care, all at the same time. Lastly, this is a critique of the WoW dev team's decisions and their journey towards the little corner they put themselves into. They might have taken lemons and made lemonade, but hey, not everyone likes lemonade, and I won't judge. Publicly. Throughout World of Warcraft Legion has been a dominant mechanic that drives the pace of gear progression. That mechanic is, well, random. From legendaries to Titan Forging to even all the small random things players were already accustomed prior to Legion, comes the most unpredictable piece of the puzzle, our artifact weapons, and specifically relics. Let me describe what relics are from my understanding. It's a system of 3 slots to be filled with items that are retrieved from numerous sources, and it makes you do stuff better. Relics have certain attributes to them, which players, and going forward the term players refers to players who care about these sorts of min-max systems, seek to get the optimum setup. Like the item level, the base trait, the light and shadow trait from the Crucible, and the bonus trait. Oh, and of course there's the question of will it drop, and will you get it? So depending on the source, there are up to 5 factors of luck you need to hit in order to get a 970 relic with everything a player wants, depending on their class and spec of course. And then you gotta multiply that by 3. So that's a lot of not having control. Before patch 7.3 there was only the item level and the base trait to worry about. The base trait is what drove players down a predictable path, and the only thing to worry about from there was if it dropped and how high of an item level it was. And this is the foundation of Blizzard's errors with relics. There's already a huge inconsistency to be found here that should be addressed, assuming that it was already identified. So if the best relic for a given player came from only a dungeon, well, it looks like that player has to farm that dungeon somehow, some way in order to get that relic. It'd have to be a high level keystone version of the dungeon if you want, like a decent item level, or a lower level dungeon in the hopes that a Titan Forge version would drop. For other players, their best relics came from raids, giving them considerably fewer chances to obtain it per week. In other words, get pooped on. Like you'll be forever gimped unless you get super lucky. As in, oh my god, RNG. Post-traumatic stress, are you feeling tingly? I'm just messing around, I'm sorry. So there wasn't any great solution for this now that the system was out in the wild. Ian Hazzikostas, the director of the World of Warcraft, explained in some detail how making efforts at reaching parity on the sources to obtain these relics would make for really chaotic loot tables. He described a possible scenario where a raid boss could have a loot table with something like 5 pieces of armor, 2 trinkets, and like 20 relics. By patch 7.2, the team was thinking of a solution for players who felt stuck knowing that their relics only came from these very few sources. A proposed solution came in the form of an order hall talent that allowed future relics to roll 2 traits. Under the hood, this bonus second trait would have been balanced in such a way that it would always provide a throughput trait, if the original base trait was not. But this was heavily criticized by players during testing. There were many reasons why the system wasn't liked, including what was tantamount to negating the previous efforts of players to obtain these relics and having to farm those low-level dungeons and raids once again. At any rate, the team shelved the idea, with the intention of returning with a better iteration in a later patch. What players did get was a vendor on the Broken Shore, allowing players to trade resources for a random relic. This, the way I see it, had a net positive effect, creating an item level floor of 880 for all relics. But the relic type was outside of the player's control, resulting in a few paths to take. One was to continue farming for relics the good old-fashioned ways I explained earlier, or to farm nether shards and try their luck at the relic slot machine. Now, super fast forward to patch 7.3, players were now provided the following: One was a much better version of this Relic Vendor. The item level floor of relics went up to 910 from 880, and now players were able to purchase the relic type of their choosing. So this effectively put an end to the low-level dungeon farming, but still left it to mythic keystones and raids for high-level sources of relics. And then of course there's Titan Forging to consider. The other thing players were provided was the answer to 7.2's double trait relic thingamajigger, the Netherlight Crucible. From the introduction of the system till today, this system has been wrought with controversy. Players looked at it and they were like, what the heck are we looking at? Like, what's this box here? And why is Wowhead showing us weird stuff? And so on. As we learned more and more from every build, the criticism and the concern came flooding in. But it appeared that while Blizzard was showing us the Crucible to take feedback, it was pretty clear that the core concepts of it would stay in place. It also be later demonstrated that for every criticism made, Blizzard did have an answer, and a reason to reinforce their decisions on the Crucible. So this brings us to today. Here's what's basically good about this entire system. One is the item level floor that comes with the Nether Shard vendor, and this floor is pretty trivial to obtain, and for Blizzard to balance feature encounters around. Setting item level aside, the Crucible creates an effective range of a relic's power that does depend on its second and third level traits, and as you all know, this pool of traits is completely random, with the exception that the bonus trait that you get in the third row will never be the same as the original base trait. In effect, every relic is useful to a certain degree. Using very simple numbers as an example, I'll just assume that the Crucible's traits will provide anywhere between a 5 and 10% increase in performance. And now for the bad. One is that it still doesn't resolve Titan Forging. The fact that relics have been subject to Titan Forging have made the practice of reading a relic's value extremely difficult. And like I said earlier, the second and third level traits are random and cannot be re-rolled, which can be very frustrating. It's easier than not to find yourself choosing between having a good light and shadow trait, but being stuck with a not so great artifact trait, or some combination of that. In other words, the Crucible gives players the opportunity to make a choice but have no control over what it is they're choosing between. It's sort of like having to choose between dying by drowning, by fire, or by being buried alive, but the actual choice is that, you want to live. Thankfully, this is just a video game and we're not nearly at that level of concern, even though we see critics say the game is literally unplayable, literally AIDS, or literally cancer. And well, you get the idea, analogies don't make for good foundations of arguments, and that is the end of my tangent. So here we are back to looking at a relic that we hope to have a high item level, expect a base trait we want, and then pray to have decent rolls in the Crucible. Here's another critique. How do players in a raid decide what relic goes to who, assuming all other factors are equal? Personally, I have an answer to that, but I'd argue that there's also a feeling of helplessness, knowing the whole would've, could've, should've if player A got the relic, and it turned out to be crap at the Crucible. I mean, what if player B happened to have a better roll? There have been a lot of suggestions, including being able to re-roll or respec traits, and previewing Crucible traits without having to go back to the Crucible itself, and not forcing the relic to soulbind when you do so. In a very recent post by Blizzard, they respond to the feedback but essentially defend the Crucible and stand their ground, saying that player suggestions are tantamount to creating, well, a crappy version of a talent tree system, another loadout to manage given a certain fight, and so on. They said, and I'm paraphrasing, that we expect players to experiment. And I agree. Giving in to these suggestions would take the teeth out of the system, remove its purpose, and turn it into another boring system that pretends to be one of choice. The reality, and you probably can't convince me otherwise, is that these sorts of systems like Reforging only have two choices: to do what the community says, or to suck. Those are crude words though. Blizzard didn't quite get to the meat of their intentions, and players have thought up all sorts of conspiracy theories that might be true. Maybe it's a way to up player participation, to prolong subscription lengths because the next quarterly is coming in a few weeks, and that sort of thing. I think it's much simpler than that. I brought this up numerous times in different ways, and I perceive this as the truth. Or it sells really well, I don't know. So I'll speak a tad more elegantly to demonstrate what I understand about the Crucible, while at the same time point and laugh into the hole that Blizzard dug itself into. I strongly believe that Blizzard does not want players to reach this absolute level of perfect optimization, and at the moment, they're using randomness to achieve this. I said earlier, using simple numbers, that Blizzard is looking for a range of 5 to 10% additional performance to come out of the Crucible, and I firmly believe that that's the range they're balancing around. and that they couldn't care less if a non-mythic raider happened to roll the greatest relic of all time. The Crucible is one of the many tools Blizzard is using to give players a unique and maybe infuriating experience, where players really just have to make do with what they've got. Mythic Raiders at least have item level going for them, but for non-Mythic Raiders, the odds of obtaining a perfect set of relics for their characters is nearly impossible. It's led to some pretty wild behavior, where sims are used to balance workable traits with item level, to help determine what's best within those small percentage points of performance. Blizzard seems to be fine with simming, it's simply using the tools the community created for itself. But it looks like Blizzard is less enthusiastic about the culture behind it. One where players don't experiment on their own, and instead of taking their journey of discovery in-game, they use a Google search. But that's sort of the reality of gaming today, isn't it? I don't think the team communicated their intentions well enough to players, speaking instead through their systems and reactionary responses to criticism. Blizzard doesn't want players to ever feel like their characters are done, gear-wise. At least that's the way I see it. They don't want best in slot, this image of a perfect toon with perfect stats encased and hoisted for the lesser rabble to look up to. That in essence creates this notion that at the tip top of a character's stats and gear, everyone is exactly the same. Blizzard instead wants a form of controlled chaos, where at the very top, similar characters are within a few percentage points of each other, differentiated by a few artifact ranks. Maybe one player has a higher item level helmet, while another has a higher item level chest piece and a better trait or something. They've wanted something like this for a long time, and the Crucible helps deliver just a little bit of that. However, this Crucible thing didn't have to exist in the first place. The problems with relics didn't have to exist altogether. Blizzard could have focused their paradigms elsewhere. And this could have been possible if they made a simple but kind of major shift. This is hindsight, of course, but they could have made it so that the only source of relics is from crafting professions, and maybe some world quests. That's really it. This way, everyone would have been on board with the Oblivion Forge and using Blood of Sargeras to upgrade relics to whatever the max item level is in a given patch. Yes, the relic level would have been easy to max out, but that ease is entirely in the hands of the realm economy. It's not a perfect method, there are flaws, most that I didn't even bother trying to think of, but it would sure cause a lot less complaining, wouldn't it? To conclude, I think that relics from the start were a problem just waiting to get worse over time. The Crucible was meant to resolve the major issues with it, but Blizzard's desire to push against perfect rolls and best in slot have led to players' dissatisfaction. My hopes are that in the very near future, Blizzard communicates their intentions clearly through their words as well as their systems. Here's the direction I would like Blizzard to not just go down, but to communicate clearly. Something like, we want players to go on a journey paved with a balanced assortment of both choices and some luck. A big influence behind that is the idea that a best in slot sort of template will be an impossible goal to reach. Not because of a lack of luck, but because that's not what we want the journey to be all about. Share your thoughts, and stay breezy.